This video is sponsored by Only Crits. Well, there's a new edition of D&D out, which means it's time for one of my favorite pastimes, creating characters. I love building D&D characters, and it's not because I'm in love with the nitty-gritty process of choosing which specific armor or weapons or spells my character is going to have. With a few exceptions, that is generally the most tedious part of the process for me. But I view creating lots of different D&D characters as basically a really fulfilling creative exercise, because creating these characters offers different challenges. What am I going to use as the inspiration for a character? How can I make different characters feel more distinct? How can I make sure they are motivated to go on adventures? Can I give them some backstory elements that are going to give the Dungeon Master some juicy material to work with? Can I make a character that actually makes me excited to play a D&D class that I generally otherwise have no interest in? There's a reason I have a whole playlist showing off the different ways you can build a character. It's not just because I think I have a lot of useful advice and insights to share, it's because I just like doing it. And today we're taking a very interesting creative challenge and using it to build a D&D character. Because I once played a 2014 D&D wizard all the way up to level 20, and I'm going to recreate him in D&D 2024. But rather than just building him at level 20, I'm going to build him as a level 1 character. And you might be asking, wait, what's the challenge there? Well, here's the challenge. I'm going to make a level 1 character where being a level 20 wizard is part of his backstory. I'm going to take those 20 levels of D&D adventures where this character journeyed across different planes of existence, fought unholy abominations made of pure chaos, helped save all of reality itself, and make those experiences canon for a first-level adventurer with single-digit spell slots and, very likely, single-digit hit points. If you like this video, let me know in the comments below. I've been really focused on all these more elaborate videos, and I'm extremely proud of those, but I also need to give myself permission to make some fun ones that don't involve weeks of research and don't have runtimes that last past 30 minutes. I'm hoping this video is going to be a little shorter than that, but at the very least, it didn't take weeks to write. And I've got other short ones that I want to make this year as well to give me more time to focus on the larger videos while also not abandoning my channel for weeks at a time. So if you want to see those videos and if you like fun experiments where different characters basically provide different creative challenges to overcome, let me know in the comments below. Now, like I said, this character I'm creating today is one that I've played before for 20 levels over the course of like 3 years of play. And playing him is definitely where I picked up a lot of my current habits as a player. It's when I settled into my role as the group note-taker, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. It codified a lot of my ideas about what makes D&D's magic system cool, and it's also where I started some of my current dice habits. I went to every session of that game with enough dice to roll any of my spells at their highest possible level, so I needed enough d6s to cast a 9th level lightning bolt or prismatic spray or whatever. But those dice were essentially color-coded for that character because it just felt good to my undiagnosed, but probably neurospicy brain to see a whole collection of dice and know that they all suited the character. Because I like just having a dice set that matches the character. And something else you should know about this character is that he had a bit of a potty mouth, much like his player. My wizard tended to say a lot of swears. So if I like having dice that are themed specifically to my character, and that character also likes to cuss, then I could not ask for a better sponsor for this video than Only Crits and their Kickstarter for the Fuck Me dice sets. Only Crits has been a fantastic sponsor to work with for a long, long time, and I am particularly excited to be able to help spread the word about this Kickstarter campaign. Because if you back this campaign, you can get some absolutely gorgeous dice sets with beautiful colors and fantastic themes. And also, the D20 says fuck you on the 20 and fuck me on the 1. Or it could say yeet for the 20 and fuck for the 1. These dice created by Only Crits kind of perfectly capture what I most enjoy about playing Dungeons & Dragons. They take the craft really seriously and create something that is visually stunning, but they also make something that's pretty irreverent and does a nice job of capturing the feelings we actually get whenever we roll a critical success or a critical failure. Depending on what level you back the project at, you can either get just a D20, or you can get the full complete dice set with the normal D20 that normally comes with them, and a matching D20 that has some cursing on it. And this is the last week of the campaign, so if you want these dice, then you better act now. So make sure to go to the link in the description to get your very own set of Fuck Me dice. Ahem. Oh, hi, Winnie the Pooh. What's up? What's up? Oh, nothing, just that I'm sort of the Only Crits spokesman around here, and you kind of stole my job. Oh, sorry, I got excited because these guys are kind of so perfect for the topic we're discussing today. Oh, I get it, and I'm glad you're excited about the product, but let's face it, you're an amateur. An amateur? Well, you didn't even mention the fact that the campaign was more than 300% funded within the first 12 hours, or how they've been blowing through their stretch goals to unlock other dice sets for the campaign. Well, no, you're right, I didn't mention those things. You didn't even bleed and mention the fact that the link in the description is an affiliate link, so if they go to the Kickstarter through that link and end up backing the project, it actually helps support your channel. I guess I left that out too. Tell you what, why don't you focus on making your funny little videos and lead the ad reads to someone who knows what they're doing, okay? Alright. Thank you so much to Only Crits for sponsoring this video. I feel like I'm losing control of my channel a little bit. Now, one of the reasons I'm so excited about solving today's creative challenge to create a level 1 character with a level 20 backstory is because level 1 characters with elaborate backstories is actually kind of one of my pet peeves at the D&D table. I don't blame players who create characters who have been through a lot before they sit down at the table. It's a fun trope to be able to come in and play the badass character who already has some experience fighting vampires or werewolves or things like that. And I do think it's more common when we're talking about monster hunters like that. At least that's where I've seen it pop up the most. And I think the reason why, especially for those monsters I just listed off, is because those are monsters that we have some pre-existing frame of reference for based on pop culture. It's less likely someone's going to sit down at the table and say that they've slain a beholder when most new players don't know what that is. But they do know movie monsters. And unless you're playing at extremely high levels, you don't really expect to see a D&D character sit down at the table and say that they have some experience slaying dragons. I'm not going to deny that that's ever happened. I'm sure some new D&D players want to play a character who's already slain some dragons. I know there are so many crazy D&D horror stories out there, and it's just unrealistic to assume someone didn't do that. But I think most people understand that that would not be appropriate for a level 1 character because we all basically understand that slaying dragons is hard. But a character who already has some experience slaying zombies or werewolves, or especially vampires actually, most players probably don't realize how challenging that's supposed to be in D&D. If you sit down to play a level 5 character, you might think, well, why can't I be Blade and have experience carving up vampires? Hell, Abraham Van Helsing was able to round up a gang and kill some vampires, and he was an old man surrounded by a bunch of fussy British weaklings and one American cowboy, because the Dracula novel actually rules, it's so good. But if they were able to handle slaying a vampire, why can't I? Well, because most players don't necessarily understand how dangerous those monsters are supposed to be in D&D, and having a level 1 character who already has some experience slaying what are supposed to be some pretty nasty monsters like vampires, it undercuts the DM's ability to set up dangers for the players. Or let's imagine one of your players has a, let's say, 3rd level character, and as part of their backstory, they fought a whole bunch of zombies. Maybe not a horde of them, but let's say they fought their way out of a crowded house full of zombies. Well, if you're running a more cinematic campaign where you expect your players to carve through undead as early as level 5, then that might be totally fine with you. Hell, if this is Draw Steel, I haven't played that game yet, but from what I understand, it seems to me like that's exactly the kind of thing a level 1 Draw Steel character could already have in their backstory, based on, again, not having played it, but what exposure I've had to the sort of design intentions of the game. But if you're running a gritty dungeon crawl or a dark fantasy game, you might not like the idea that one of your players already has the backstory of killing a bunch of zombies. Their backstory could be incompatible with the threats you want to establish for your players. Because as the Dungeon Master, part of your job is to control the power scaling for the campaign. You want to introduce lower level monsters early on that feel like a bigger threat because the players are also low level. So your players can feel powerful for overcoming them, and then they can actually chart their progress as they begin to take on nastier and nastier creatures. And so when a player comes in and already establishes that their character has beaten some monsters, that might potentially hamstring your efforts to essentially establish tension around monsters if one of your player characters can say, oh, I face worse than this. Likewise, it might conflict with the world building the Dungeon Master has in mind, or even some of the tropes of the game itself. When my friends and I ran a campaign in the Unknown Armies system, my first character was basically completely useless and was kind of in the wrong campaign, so when we jumped into what was basically Season 2 of the story, I rolled up a new character. A badass monster hunter in a black leather duster who rides a motorcycle, and he had silver bullets because he was trying to hunt werewolves who had killed his family. Yes, obviously, he was a cliché. Part of the fun of playing role-playing games is getting a chance to be the cliché characters we see in movies and on TV shows, and more on that in a minute. But the first time my character spoke with one of the NPCs who knew anything about the magic and monsters in the setting, and I mentioned the werewolves in my backstory, the DM basically stopped the game and told me, oh yeah, that's not how werewolves work in this game. I'd built my character based off of the false assumption that this monster functioned the same way it did in pop culture. Now, clearly that means there was some sort of miscommunication between me and the game master when I created my character to be a werewolf hunter in a system where werewolves don't work the way I expected. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? Whether it's because of the rules of the game itself, what monsters are even in the game, or how dangerous those monsters are, or because the way your game master wants to make sure you understand the threat each monster poses to you, it doesn't really work if one of your characters can shrug and say, this is nothing compared to the time I faced a giant who was about to destroy Neverwinter and slayed it single-handedly. This actually brings me to the other big issue with this approach. The player isn't in control of the world building for the campaign. That's the domain of the Dungeon Master. That's not true for all games. Daggerheart pretty famously has the ability to add major details to the backstory of the local area. It gives more power to the players, so it's possible any major history you give your character is compatible with the world that your DM is creating because you're creating it together. But if you're not playing a game like that, if you're playing something like D&D, it's possible that the backstory of your character is going to come into conflict with the setting the Dungeon Master has created. This is not exclusively a problem for low-level characters who are too high-powered, but it absolutely can happen with those types of characters. Now, there are two easy ways to make this character still work in the game. The first is to make the character an old man. Whatever skills they had and whatever monsters they faced, they're not as capable of slaying those same creatures today because they've just lost a lot of their skills. And if they've got a few details wrong about the campaign setting, yeah, they're an old man, what do you expect? This presents some other problems, and it actually, I think especially doesn't work well for wizards, and we'll talk about that in a second, but this is still a really solid archetype. Very minor spoilers for Campaign 3 of Critical Role, but at the very beginning of the campaign, one of the characters did actually have some experience fighting more nasty monsters, but now they were elderly, and so we got the sense that whatever experience they had might not necessarily translate into combat prowess, because their skills had atrophied. But even so, they still had some mechanical advantages over the rest of the party to reflect their experience. And if everybody at the table is okay with that, then that's totally fine. That's exactly the kind of thing the cast of Critical Role goes wild for, because they are a little more willing to play fast and loose with balance and rules if it better serves the story. But most of us can't assume that's going to be okay with the other players at the table. It requires a lot of trust and a detailed conversation. But the other way you can make this archetype completely work for you is if your character is full of shit. There's a point coming up in our Critical Role Demystified episodes very soon where the players encounter a new character played by a player who's joining them at the table. It's not an NPC, it is a player character. And this character has this robust history of monsters they've slain and adventures they've had. And then we discover soon after it was all pretty heavily exaggerated, which was actually kind of clear right away because the moment they met this character, the cast even compared him to Gilderoy Lockhart from Harry Potter, who was a huge liar. And I'm not going to lie, the Lockhart character template is a really fun archetype to play with. Maybe we'll even tackle that idea in the future, because that could be a fun video. I think there's potentially some ways it may cause friction at the table, but I think you can communicate with your fellow players in a way where it could still be a lot of fun. However, we're not using that approach for today's character, because I know my wizard isn't full of shit, because I already do know all the things that happened to his 20-level character. I played through those adventures. And in fact, a few of you might also know what happened to him. You see, about 10 years ago, my friends and I ran a D&D actual play podcast. It unfortunately didn't survive the COVID pandemic. Our second campaign ended pretty abruptly, and as the Dungeon Master of that second campaign, I can tell you it was kind of a mercy killing. Don't go back and listen to the second campaign. It was a mess. I made a lot of mistakes. But that first campaign was a lot of fun, and I'm still really proud of the story my friends and I told. That show's over. I get no benefit from still talking about it or promoting it on my channel. I just feel really passionately about the adventures we had. And if you were at all interested in checking out another actual play show that's done, there's no more episodes coming, I think you could do worse than checking out the first campaign of Friday Night Quest. It's all on YouTube, link in the description. But my character was a human wizard named Sweeney. He was red-haired and skinny, because D&D is a fantasy game, so he got to live my fantasy of being skinny. But he was also dirty and grungy. He was also often the smartest person in the room. At least that was the idea behind the character. Obviously, he was limited by my own real-world ability to actually do intelligent things, which I was not always capable of doing. But I was basically able to capture that fantasy of being the smartest person in the room by just having a lot of elaborate plans and doing a good job of pitching them to the rest of the party. So I was still the planning guy. And part of the reason I was so good at planning is because I knew the system really well. I was building lots of characters and running lots of campaigns and just watching so many 5e actual play shows, so I just happened to have a natural advantage to building plans in our game because I didn't just know a lot of creative uses for my spells, but I also knew basically the entire roster of druid spells that my fellow party member had access to. And it's easier to form plans when you know the strengths and weaknesses of the rest of your party. And I was also one of the only ones at the table who took notes during every session, and I also edited the episodes, which meant I got to hear our old adventures over and over again, which meant I retained details from other adventures better than the rest of the cast did. And I was also able to re-listen to them and gain a new perspective and pick up on clues that we'd missed. And so just by taking notes and being attentive, through my own fancy way of doing so, but that's basically still all I was doing, I was sometimes able to capture the fantasy of being the smartest guy in the room. Again, sometimes. I also had the advantage of playing that character for 20 levels, so I got to experience the pros and cons of the different ways you can play the smart guy. I talked about this a lot when I reviewed the Critical Role episodes that still featured Tiberius, but there are two ways to play the smartest person in the room. For shorthand, we can refer to those today as the open book approach and the closed book approach. The first approach is the open book approach, which we tended to see a lot more often in Critical Role with Percy throughout the first campaign. Percy will generally share a lot of his strategy plans with the rest of the party in advance. He still tries to capture a little bit more of the closed book approach on occasion, specifically when he is inventing things, because that's a more isolated scenario. It really only involves him and the Dungeon Master, and he's basically working up to a surprise for the rest of the players. But even in his interactions with Matt, he still gives Matt as much information as he can, and there are a few times where he can't, but it's not because he's trying not to give Matt information, it's just because Taliesin, the player, can't literally figure out a way to describe what he's trying to do. So he needs to pause, take some time away from the table to draw it out or find a better way to describe it, and then come back to Matt with more detail. Taliesin would also still make some assumptions about what was reasonable versus what wasn't, but he was generally not trying to be cagey with information. He may have sometimes been wrong about what was reasonable, but he wasn't hiding things from Matt. Even in the most recent episode we reviewed on this channel, Percy was planning something as a surprise for the other players, but when they finally asked him about it, he just dropped the idea that it could be a surprise and shared his idea with the rest of them. Because Taliesin understood that surprises are only fun as long as not knowing something isn't frustrating to the other players, which is why he didn't keep his battle strategies private. He shared them with the other players and allowed them to all brainstorm together to perfect whatever rough ideas he'd come up with. The closed book approach is generally more cinematic and more dramatic, angling for those big reveals where everybody realizes you have this awesome plan up your sleeve. And when you watch the early episodes of Critical Role, this is often what Tiberius was doing, only telling the other players just enough of the plan so they know their role in it, but they don't necessarily know what he's going to do. It's a very natural impulse when you're playing D&D. A lot of players do it. I've done it. I've run for other players that have done it. But the downside of it is that essentially it means the other players are completely out of the loop. And depending on the situation or the table and the dynamic with the other players, that can be okay. But if you lose the trust of the other players due to, let's say, other factors, then suddenly the fact that you don't share your plans with them doesn't really go over as well as it used to. On Critical Role, the group reached the point where even when Orion was trying to accomplish tasks, he wouldn't always share his full plans, even with Matt, which made it very, very difficult for them to move forward. Obviously, there were extenuating circumstances that aggravated that dynamic. I'm not trying to relitigate the Orion drama. I made 28 videos about his time on the show. I'm not making another one. But I'm trying to explain that I very much understand the creative impulse behind some of those decisions. In the case of my level 20 wizard, I had the benefit of getting to play the character for a long, long time, and realized that as fun and cinematic as the closed book approach is for you as a player, the open book approach still allows you to have the fantasy of being the brilliant character coming up with ideas, but it also helps you treat your fellow players as equals, which is really important. The reason my character was originally much less likely to share his plans with the rest of the party is because at the beginning of the campaign, he was a lot more of a cliche character, the type we might see from pop culture. He was inspired more than a little bit by characters like Christensen, the edgy wizard with a complicated backstory who will still work with the team but will also throw out a lot of sarcastic quips and insults. And he knows that he has a good plan, so he doesn't always bother explaining what he has in mind because he knows that people will either understand why he did what he did once the situation has passed, or they won't, which means they're stupid and they're not worth explaining things to. It's not worth your time.
Close your eyes.
Why?
Sit yourself.
Additionally, Sweeney was just kind of a gross dirtbag, just dirty and stinky. He sleeps in his clothes and basically only wears the same set of clothes forever. Originally, he was also going to be a smoker, but I was still able to capture some of that same vibe by just having him always have pockets full of gross material components. I always pictured that there was weird gunk underneath his fingernails all the time. He was just kind of gross. That part of his character didn't come from Constantine, but from Raceland from the Dragonlance novels. Between his use of spell components and his gross medicinal tea, I combined that idea with the life of an adventurer, and I figured Sweeney would just be a little grungy and gross. Of course, it wasn't until years later that I realized my character also had a lot of influence from Mad Sweeney from American Gods. Obviously, you would think I would have clicked on that earlier, but I genuinely didn't make the connection of how much that character was influenced by the other character until the TV show came out, and I realized, oh, shit, my wizard is a skinny, grungy, red-haired asshole who specializes in sleight of hand and illusions and is literally named Sweeney. This was not a very original concept at all.
Watch this. Now that's a coin trick for you.
How'd you do it?
With panache.
So why you loading coins up your sleeves?
Sounds like a lot of work to me. It's easier just to pluck them out of the air. Simplest trick in the world.
How'd you do it?
Tell you what. I'll fight you for it.
Okay, well that's something my Sweeney would never, ever do. My Sweeney was much more of a coward. He had spent a few years living on the street before getting picked up by another wizard who was basically running a gang of wizard apprentices, like Fagin from Oliver Twist. Although, actually I think it was more directly inspired by Robin Williams' character in the movie August Rush, a film you probably haven't thought about in 17 years. But there was another big influence from my mentor, the Purple Man from Marvel Comics. The Jessica Jones TV show hadn't premiered yet, but he had still done a lot of horrible things in the comics that my dungeon master and I could use as inspiration, because my mentor had a habit of enchanting people, charming them to do whatever he wanted. And he wanted to do a lot of bad things, though I will say for the record, not the types of bad things Kilgrave did in the show. We didn't go to those places. Instead, it was a lot of it was still a lot of gaslighting and emotional abuse, especially for the wizards he was training. So my character was basically raised by a psychopath who used magic to manipulate people, in some cases messing with our memories to make us think certain things that absolutely were not true. And one of the straws that broke the camel's back for my character was when we were commanded to immolate a bunch of innocent people. And for those of you who've watched any amount of Campaign 2 of Critical Role, yes, there are definitely a lot of similarities between Sweeney and the character you're picturing. I've talked about that on the channel before. They even both use material components, they're both bisexual, and they both smelled pretty bad, although that was a much more deliberate decision on my part. But that's the thing about archetypes. Two players can be inspired by some of the same source material and come up with characters that have some very superficial similarities, but still wind up playing them totally differently, so they really are very different characters. Sweeney was inspired a lot more by different corners of pop culture, mostly by the sarcastic assholes in my favorite media. Like, there was probably not a small amount of Sawyer from Lost influencing the way I played Sweeney. But what fascinated me most about him was realizing how many layers of self-loathing Sweeney was dealing with. And by dealing with, I mean basically pushing away everyone in his life by being an asshole because he didn't like it when people liked him. It truly was not until basically the very end of the campaign, like the second to last session, I think, that he was able to overcome the last of his trauma he'd been dealing with and finally become someone that I would ever consider to be a good person. It took a long road for him to be, I think, a good guy. And so, after the campaign, I became fascinated with the idea that Sweeney might actually continue being an adventurer and begin using some of his talents for good instead of just for mischief. Now, initially, my plan was for him to show up as an NPC in the second campaign. He would be a high-level NPC, basically working behind the scenes, probably wouldn't show up for, I guess, at least until halfway through, and probably be in disguise. He wouldn't even be an old man anymore because thanks to the clone spell, he got access to that in the late days of the first campaign, but thanks to that spell, he could basically show up at any place in the campaign setting and be any age, so the other players might not even recognize him. He could have stashed clone tubes in safe houses all over the world, so if he ever died, I would eventually be able to bring him back either later in the same campaign, oh, never mind, you thought I died, well, I did die, but I'm back, or he could just show up in the third campaign, or at some other point in the future. It's actually kind of the perfect finale for his character, for him to just continue to live on, because he died so many times during the course of that first campaign. So it makes perfect sense for him to have found a way to basically cheat death forever, and keep being this helpful NPC who can pop up in any of my games, and then if he dies, he's not off the table. Because I ultimately think that is the best way to use this character going forward. He should just be this wise old man in a potentially relatively young body who might help out as a mentor or a supporting NPC, but then he can be killed off, but then can still be used again in my next campaign. He's the ultimate NPC helper. However, ever since the actual play show ended and I never got a chance to actually deploy Sweeney in my second campaign, this idea has been chewing away at the back of my brain. What if I did want to bring him back, not as an NPC, but as a player character? What if I wanted to play him again? Is it possible to slightly tweak this NPC and actually turn him into a player character? Can we overcome all the things I hate about taking an overpowered low-level character and actually turn him into somebody who wouldn't cause problems at the D&D table? So first, let's talk about why he can't just be an old man who retired and his glory days are behind him. It's a shame because I really do like that trope. I love the old warrior who hung up his weapons long ago and is now being called out of retirement to be a supporting character in the adventures of other protagonists. Obi-Wan Kenobi, elderly Bruce Wayne in Batman Beyond, Anthony Hopkins in The Mask of Zorro, Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi. I genuinely love that shit. I love the characters who are physically frail, but have all this intellect from their days as an adventurer, but that knowledge could even still be imperfect because Things have changed since they were young, which gives the Dungeon Master a lot more wiggle room because it's not a guarantee that this old man still has all the answers. And this approach can absolutely work if you're playing a low-level martial character, or maybe even a cleric. But there are a few problems with this approach. The first is, how do you explain why this character doesn't have any of his old magic items? That's not an insurmountable problem, but it is one you have to figure out the answer for. When you play 2017 God of War, the fact that Kratos is not using his awesome blades from the earlier games is a major plot point. Like, from a gameplay perspective, there's no reason you couldn't just start the game with them. But narratively, it made a lot more sense for this version of the character to have hidden them away. But when you go from 2017 God of War to God of War Ragnarok, suddenly you don't have all the same fancy armor you spent an entire game crafting out of shards of gods or whatever. And ultimately, that's a decision that did stem from what would make the gameplay more fun. So no matter what reason we're given within the text, we kind of know it's artificial. We know that the designers just didn't want to start you off with a bunch of god-level items, especially when they don't know what weapons you ended the last game using. So they have to strip you down to something more basic and allow you to build up your new inventory. And I don't blame them at all, by the way. Video game sequels do this all the time. Spider-Man 2... Okay, full disclosure, I didn't grow up playing video games, and we have just run out of video games I watched my wife play before our child was born, but I know it does happen in other franchises too. So unless your GM wants you to start the game with more magic items than the other players have, which I don't think that's a good idea, then you have to figure out why you don't have your magic items anymore. And it could literally be for any reason. You had to sell them to make ends meet. You ditched them so you'd be harder to scry on. They ran out of magic and broke. It doesn't really matter what the explanation is. However, being an old man doesn't necessarily mean you couldn't still be an awesome adventurer today. That's the other big problem. Yes, we could just say that you've retired for a few decades and you've gotten rusty, but there are some D&D classes where being old is kind of integrated into the core fantasy of the class. If you're playing a high-level druid, it's built into the class identity itself that your character eventually just starts aging super slowly, so it kind of works against the premise of the class for an older druid to have lost power rather than perpetually gaining it. You can make it work, but there's some narrative friction there. The same goes for the 2014 monk, where at level 15, you stop feeling the effects of age on your body because that's part of the martial arts movie fantasy, the old man who's actually still an incredible martial artist. But if we're talking about D&D classes where being an old man actually makes you a better version of the class, there's no better example than the wizard itself. The most famous, all-powerful wizards in all of fiction are old men, Gandalf and Merlin. Other characters like Dumbledore all follow the template of those classic wizards. They're old men, but they're also insanely powerful spellcasters. In theory, it shouldn't matter how physically frail a wizard is. The older they get, the more magic they know. Unless they are actively in cognitive decline, but, that's not a very fun concept to play at the table. But you could still handwave that and say, no, they used to know all these spells, but they haven't been casting magic for decades, so they forgot a bunch of them. The Luke Skywalker approach. And as they level up, they're going to have to regain the ability to cast all these old spells. Again, I love that trope too. I've always wanted to play a bard who basically has become a comfortable Broadway star and there's a whole team that does everything for them now. But now they're out in the middle of an adventure and they have to fend for themselves using the few spells they know, they realize, oh wow, I really don't have that many skills anymore. And as the adventure continues, they keep remembering all these spells they used to know back when they were a struggling performer, used to use magic to take care of everything because there was no support team. And so they're basically unlocking old skills they haven't used in forever. But this doesn't quite work for the wizard, because of the spellbook. If you still have your old spellbook from when you were an adventurer, then you would have way more spells than you're supposed to have access to at low levels. A first level wizard is supposed to have 6 first level spells in their spellbook, but at second level, they have 8. So if your character is using an older spellbook from their glory days, then presumably, they already have access to more spells than they're supposed to have. Now you can get around this too by having them lose their spellbook at some point in the years before the adventure begins. So now they basically have a new spellbook that only has the low-level spells they've held onto. And that can work just fine. Although I actually have another solution for how they can have their old spellbook but not have access to everything it contains, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Additionally, this trope still kind of relies on them being the forgetful, absent-minded wizard. And this may just be completely personal, but I feel like that trope can be really hit and miss. I like when Gandalf is old and cranky because he doesn't remember something. I like when Merlin is off in his own head and not entirely paying attention to everything. I like that aspect of Tiberius. I have my own issues with the times and ways it was implemented, but I like the core idea behind it. And perhaps unsurprisingly, I think Taliesin found a better way to capture that energy with one of his Campaign 2 characters, who wasn't always the best at paying attention. But there are also some examples where that trope just gets under my skin. I realize this is going to sound like sacrilege to people who grew up with Dragonlance, but in that first Dragonlance book, the character of Fizban is forgetful and inattentive, and the specific ways that's deployed within the story just are not that funny to me. I never thought it was quite as funny as the book clearly did. And, of course, there's examples like spoilers for Dragonlance, but a later book where a character who seems forgetful is actually more powerful than you expected, or Yoda seems like a doddering old fool, but actually, no, that was all just a ruse. That's sort of a exception to the rule that you can judge that on its own merits, but if you're actually kind of forgetful, it can be kind of hit and miss for me. So by all means, you can play the forgetful old man who doesn't remember all of his old spells. I hope you have a fantastic time doing so. But I have a very specific preference for the way we see that sort of narrative beat play out in fiction, so I wouldn't want to rely on that trope as the entire reason why Sweeney doesn't have access to all of his old spells. However, in the case of Sweeney specifically, I have some interesting ways to help solve some of these problems. Because like I said earlier, toward the end of the campaign, he got access to the clone spell. So we can explain that after that first campaign, he started setting up safe houses with clone tubes, waiting in vats for whenever he died, so he could wake up in a new body. And rather than keeping them all in one place, he spread out his clones so that if one of his safe houses was discovered, he wouldn't lose all of his clones. This helps explain why he doesn't have all of his old magic items anymore. They were probably in the possession of the original Sweeney. Or maybe he stashed some magic items alongside the clone tube if this campaign is starting at higher levels and everyone has a couple of magic items. Then I can say, okay, cool. He has one from either from the old campaign or one that he found at some time in between campaigns, and I can just choose a different magic item. But if that's not the case, if no one has magic items, then Sweeney either didn't have any magic items that he could spare to leave for this specific clone, or someone broke in at some point and stole stuff from the safe house. They left the clone tube unattended because why would they bother with it unless they actually knew what it was and who was inside? But they just stole all the magic shit. This could also explain why he has to build a new spellbook from scratch. Someone could have stolen the old spellbook. And because the final days of that first campaign were about journeying to different planes of existence and saving all of reality, maybe he started traveling to other versions of the material plane and leaving clone tubes on other worlds. Which means, whether the Game Master is running in Greyhawk or the Forgotten Realms or Exandria or one of the Magic the Gathering settings or a homebrew world, I don't have to explain that my earlier adventures took place in the same world. Sweeney could have just come here and left one of his clones behind, so he could be a hero here whenever he passed away. But hang on, I hear you saying. If he was a level 20 adventurer, then his clone would also be level 20. After all, a clone still retains all their old knowledge and skills. But this is where we get to the part of this idea that really excites me. You see, Sweeney was a half-elf when we last saw him at the end of the campaign. But he was not born a half-elf, he was born as a human. Then partway through the campaign, he was killed, and the druid reincarnated him as a halfling. Shortly after that, very shortly after that actually, he died again and was brought back as a half-elf. And near the very end of the campaign, he was killed one more time.
Oh no, not again.
This time, the druid had access to true resurrection, so he still came back as a half-elf. But the half-elf does not appear in the 2024 Player's Handbook. So if I'm recreating this character in D&D 2024, how may I recreate him when the half-elf does not exist? Well, I could just use the stats for the human or the elf and declare that he's just a half-elf and hope the GM is cool with half-elves existing in this world, even through special circumstances. Or I could get really fucking weird with it. So here's the idea that really excites me about turning Sweeney into a player character. Because he's died so many times and come back in so many different forms, then once he started using the clone spell, so he could basically live forever, maybe he didn't realize that something had gone wrong. Maybe his soul is just not used to coming back to its own body, so some randomness has begun to change these clones as they were growing in their tubes. So they're not growing the way he expected. And something is also going wrong with the transfer whenever he wakes up in a new body. He's lost whatever spells he had memorized, so he's not a level 20 wizard anymore. He, in fact, has just enough mental energy to be whatever level wizard the other characters are when the campaign begins. In fact, maybe a spellbook was left behind, but it's encoded, and the code word that would help decrypt the entire book is the word he uses for power word kill, which he always had memorized. But because he doesn't remember that spell, he can't decode the entire book, which is very carefully encoded with a changing cipher that you basically have to brute force on every page if you don't know the word that's supposed to kick off the entire process from the back. It was a security measure, so that his clones would have access to all their spells, but someone who broke into the safe house and found the spellbook wouldn't just suddenly get access to all the spells of a 20-plus level wizard. But now that he doesn't remember just one of his spells, he no longer has access to all of his other spells either, which means he'll be leveling up as normal, breaking the codes on a couple spells every time he levels up. This also means that I don't have to be locked into whatever spells the first version of Sweeney knew in that first campaign. We can basically imply that he went off and found or invented a whole bunch more spells and put them into these spellbooks, and so now he's basically gaining whatever spells he's able to decode every time he levels up, giving me the freedom to not just select the same spells every time I play the character. And as for his species, It's randomized every time he wakes up in a new clone body. He's so used to being regenerated in different forms, his body's doing it instinctively now. I would literally not know what species I'm playing until I sat down at the table for session 0. I could also roll a D100, and that's the relative age of the body that he woke up in. They may not all be perfect 40-year-olds or whatever Sweeney originally intended. Maybe they would be the equivalent of 40 years old, or they might be the equivalent of 95 years old, whatever that age looks like for that species. His stats can also be randomized, which means I'm not always sitting down at the table with a character with an intelligence of 20. I can use whatever stat generation method the DM determines, including rolling for stats whenever possible, because that's just my favorite thing to do. Which basically means I finally figured out how to play as the Doctor from Doctor Who.
Hello. Okay. New teeth. That's weird.
I actually think this idea really started getting its hooks into me around the time I started getting back into Doctor Who, around the 60th anniversary. I mostly enjoyed those anniversary specials. I mostly enjoyed the first season of Ncuti Gatwa's time as the Doctor. I haven't seen season 2 because I'm behind on everything. But with me getting back into the series, I was also just sort of dipping my toes into the various corners of the fandom, very carefully, since that fandom got really weird and toxic while I wasn't looking. But while I was basically easing myself into the Doctor Who swimming pool, I discovered that there were all these Doctor Who audio dramas that I really didn't know anything about. I'd been aware they existed before. I knew they'd made a bunch of adventures for the 8th Doctor, which was really nice because he only got to be in a TV movie that wasn't very well received, so at least in the audio format, he got to have his own adventures and his other companions. But I truly had no idea what a rabbit hole those audio adventures were. Keeping up with those would basically be a whole huge hobby all on its own. But the thing I was truly shocked to discover is that my first Doctor, Christopher Eccleston, had returned to the role and started playing him again in audio dramas.
If you're hearing me now, I'm already dead, but that's alright. I've been dead before. There are worse ways to spend your day. The important thing is I'm coming back.
I always come back.
I think this is when I really started getting interested in what it would be like for Sweeney to essentially be the Doctor Who D&D adventurer I've always wanted to play. I've made characters in this series before who were very directly inspired by Doctor Who, but I never imagined I would actually ever be able to figure out a way to incorporate the regenerations into a character concept. And the irony is, I'd completely forgotten about this, but Doctor Who was definitely on my mind as I was playing Sweeney, and he kept coming back in all these different bodies. Each one had their own style of how they dressed. The halfling Sweeney was directly inspired by Christopher Eccleston's Doctor in his appearance. When we ran a flashback game centered on a young human Sweeney, his design was modeled after Matt Smith. Doctor Who was already kind of in the DNA of this character, so this would just be kind of a perfect way to take this concept and really continue to explore it in what I hope would be a really fun and interesting way. Additionally, I think this would be a really fun way to take this character and play the Obi-Wan of a group, the supportive mentor who's already seen it all and done it all and been through his own character arcs, and is now just interested in shepherding in the next generation of heroes. He's not a brooding loner. He's been through that part of his life. He's left that behind. It took him literally 20 levels to become a good man, but now I think he is one. But that doesn't always mean he's going to do everything right in the right way every time. He's still going to make mistakes, because he's being played by me. And he will probably always still have a bit of an edge. After all, he used to be a very bad person. He did a lot of nasty things when he was younger.
Good men don't need rules. Today is not the day to find out why I have so many.
But the fun thing is, I know exactly what he's done and what he's capable of. Anyone can find that out. Those episodes are all on YouTube. But he's come to terms with a lot of that stuff. If my Dungeon Master wanted to dig into those old episodes and find old villains or monsters they wanted to use that had some particular significance to my character, that would obviously be amazing. But I would also be more than happy to just give my Game Master a list of monsters and say, these are the ones he's fought in the past. If you're open to it, I'd like to play a character who at least knows a little bit about each of these monsters, basically able to call upon his past experiences for some very basic lore.
Sontaran! That's your name, isn't it? You're a Sontaran. How did I know that, eh? Fascinating, isn't it? Isn't that worth keeping me alive?
But if my DM doesn't want me to be basically using this character as a way to cheat and for my character to have all the information that I, as a player of D&D, have because I played the game for a long time, if that feels just a bit too much like an unfair way to metagame without metagaming, and it puts the other players in a position where they can't do the same thing because that idea didn't occur to them, so they have to still act like they don't know anything about the monsters that they uncover, but I get to cheat because I know certain things about certain monsters. If that's how the DM feels, they could let me know, and that's totally fine. I've already established that his memory might be a little bit fuzzy, so if I encounter evidence of any monster, whether it's one Sweeney faced in the first campaign or not, I can just default to an Arcana check to figure out what my character knows about them. If I roll high, yeah, we can say he remembers some stuff he learned about them, or maybe he's even faced them in the first campaign or after the first campaign. He knows some stuff about them. But his memory could also be fuzzy enough that he doesn't recall every detail about every monster in the multiverse, even the ones he has encountered. So he can just figure out some things about these monsters as they come up through the campaign through trial and error, and through skill checks and proper investigations and experiencing the adventure.
If we're going to find their weakness, we need to find out where they're from. Which planet? So, judging by their basic shape, that narrows it down to 5,000 planets within traveling distance. What else do we know about them? Information.
They're green.
Yep, narrows it down.
A good sense of smell.
Narrows it down.
They can smell adrenaline.
Narrows it down.
The pig technology.
Narrows it down. What else? What else? Hyphenated surname. Yes! That narrows it down to one planet. Raxicorico.
Because the point is that I don't want him to be the main character of whatever adventure he's a part of. If I wanted to do that, I would just write some novels where he's going on awesome adventures. And you know what? Maybe I still will wind up doing that. That sounds fun. I like Sweeney a lot. I think a 20th level version of him going around different realities fighting evil would be dope. But at the D&D table, I think I would have so much more fun playing as somebody who is just the wise old mentor in whatever body he randomly happened to get. But from my perspective, all these adventures would keep happening to the same character. But that would not require the game master to do any extra work on their part to validate the concept. I've already taken care of all that on my side of the table. In fact, Sweeney can change so much throughout his various transformations and experiences. They could have different outfits and attitudes and use different arcane implements. One version might use a wand or a staff or a crystal ball or material components, and that decision would be determined by what fits best for that incarnation of Sweeney.
Oh, a new one.
Lovely. Doctor, you don't have your screwdriver.
Oh yeah, I'm over screwdrivers. They spoil the line of your jacket. These days I'm all about wearable technology.
No.
Need this?
No, I'm fine.
Oh no, of course. You mostly went hands-free, didn't you? Like, hey, I'm the doctor. I can save the universe using a kettle and some string. And look at me, I'm wearing a vegetable.
In fact, each new Sweeney might have a different subclass, because this particular iteration is more interested in defending himself, whereas the next iteration may focus more on conjuring fireballs and other elemental powers. And I might have my own rationalizations for that based on the previous adventures he went on in other campaigns, but none of that would require any extra work for the game master or the other players. In fact, Sweeney could even pop up in a campaign that wasn't even run in Dungeons & Dragons. He could show up in a Daggerheart game, or a Shadowdark game, or Pathfinder, or Draw Steel, or DC-20, or Tales of the Valiant. Anything that plays by the same basic rules and genre conventions of D&D would basically be fair game. Of course, because Sweeney is basically designed so his new body keeps returning to a new clone every time he dies, I don't know if the other player characters would be able to resurrect him. Maybe Revivify would make sense. I think if I would basically ask my DM if we could carve that out as an exception. Otherwise, the other players would be potentially screwed if he died during a tough combat. I speak from experience on that one. But if Sweeney ever died in combat and the party wasn't able to revivify him, I think I would just say that his soul went off to go find the next clone pod, and he would be retired from that campaign. I'd probably draft a letter that the other players could find on my body that would basically help to explain the fact that they shouldn't waste their time trying to resurrect him. Writing a letter that's meant to be read upon the condition of his death was already something Sweeney did a couple of times in that first campaign, so it would absolutely be in character for him to write a letter and basically warn the other characters not to waste their gold on him. He's gone. And if I was really immersed in the campaign and I want to keep playing, I would just roll up a replacement character. Maybe I'd talk to the DM about Sweeney coming back in a clone tube that wasn't terribly far away and rejoining the campaign after a couple of levels, still with none of his old items and completely new stats. It would basically just be like rolling up a new character who was also a wizard, but there would be no onboarding required to catch him up with what's happened in the campaign so far. But if either me or the DM didn't feel like that was the right call, if we felt it was too cheap or it reduced the impact of Sweeney's death, then once again, that's totally fine. That can just be the end of Sweeney's time in that campaign. Of course, it's possible there's one more thing we could do to make Sweeney just a little bit more like the Doctor from Doctor Who. We could give him an alias. Now, technically, Sweeney already was an alias, that was not his given name, and I wouldn't really want his true identity to be this big, grand mystery, because that's kind of the part of Doctor Who that I can't stand, when they talk about the Doctor's name like it's this mythical thing that's basically not just a name, but instead it's this grand conspiracy of the cosmos.
Doctor Who? It's more than just a secret, isn't it?
Even the word doctor is false. Your real name is hidden. It burns in the stars, in the cascade of Medusa herself.
There's only one reason I would ever tell anyone my name. There's only one time I could.
The question that must never be answered. Hidden in plain sight. The question you've been running from all your life. Doctor Who? Doctor who? Doctor who?
Yeah, I hate that shit. I prefer it when the Doctor is just an aspirational title, something he calls himself because that's who he wants to be.
They were kind of posh. They'd use titles like the Doctor or the Bishop or the Rani or the Conquistador. Say Doctor for 1,000 years and it becomes my name.
I murder a beautiful, innocent creature as painlessly as I can. And then I find a new name because I won't be the Doctor anymore.
I also like the idea that Sweeney probably wouldn't go by that name anymore because he became this world-famous adventurer, maybe even world's famous adventurer, and now he just wants to draw less attention.
I got too big, Dorian, too noisy. Time to step back into the shadows.
Of course, just because he was famous once in my campaign does not at all mean that anyone in my DM's campaign has to know who Sweeney is. If the DM wants to incorporate him as some legendary hero, they could do so, that'd be fun, but otherwise I am perfectly happy with the name Sweeney and the events he did being lost to time. But again, I still like the idea that he uses a new title now. The Doctor is obviously a great fit for somebody who is essentially a pacifist, especially because he's the lead character of a children's television program, so he can't really run around murdering people all the time, so the name Doctor works really well for that. The last time I made a Doctor-style character, I named him The Advocate. But I've since realized there's another title that I like a little bit more. A title that works better than something like Doctor or even Advocate for a game where characters basically go around doing a lot of murder. So the title isn't one that Sweeney chose to remind him not to hurt people. It's a D&D game. People are going to get hurt. Instead, it's a title that he chose as a reminder to be responsible with his power, to be very careful with whom he sentences to death. He was definitely too quick in that first campaign to declare that certain people should or shouldn't be alive, and some of his darkest moments came when he crossed the threshold and used lethal force when it was no longer justifiable. So what he needs is the title that reminds him to keep that part of him in check, something that tells him that if he's going to kill something, he should step back and be as impartial as he can. He should use his best judgment. So maybe his new title is The Judge. Now, earlier this year, I made a video about a monk that would be fun to play, and I named that character Juror Number 7. I made a reference to how they were part of a faction called the Jury, and maybe the leader is actually called the Judge, because that's a name I'd been saving for another character I wanted to play, but it could also work well for that NPC. And then when I introduced a coded manuscript called the Journal of the Judge in one of my recent adventures, some of y'all made the connection and determined that that journal must be connected to the leader of the jury. But in truth, I do consider if the judge who leads the jury is in my campaigns, he's a different NPC. That's a different idea. Although, that being said, if I'm playing in a campaign and Sweeney/the judge dies and I think the party could use a monk, then I reserve the right to change my mind and introduce Juror Number 7 as an acolyte of Sweeney/the judge. But in reality, when I talk about the judge as a character that has some impact on my campaign setting by writing journals about their awesome past adventures, this is the version of the character that I mean. Not one who leads the jury, but this one, the one that I also want to play when I sit down at the table to play another campaign, the one who used to be Sweeney. And the fun part is that I have no idea what that character is going to be. For example, maybe I sit down at the table for the session 0 where we all create our characters, I roll a d100 and I get 52. This version of the judge is aged to whatever the equivalent of his early 50s is for whatever species he is. I roll a d10 and I get a 3 and I check the 2024 reincarnate chart, and this tells me that the first judge is going to be a dwarf. Maybe I roll for stats and I get something like this: 16, 12, 14, 16, 9, 11, which means this version of the judge is probably going to be pretty good at a lot of things. Maybe I go look at the charts in the 2014 Player's Handbook and I roll some random numbers to determine the height and weight for this version of the judge. And then I create a version that is specific to this campaign. But then maybe at some point, someone in my party talks to somebody else, one of our mutual friends, and they also mentioned that I played the judge in their campaign. Only that version was a gnome in his 80s. Or, no, I also played with him and it was a dragonborn in his early 20s, or a 12-year-old ribbit. But from my perspective, they would all be canon. They'd all just be the same character, just at different points in his life. I just think that would be really exciting. So, Ottawickets, just like I told you in that video from May, you are not the judge. I wanted to put that rumor to bed. The judge is a wizard player character that I want to play in future campaigns, and you are not him.
You're right. I'm not the judge. Wink.
No, really, you're not the judge.
You're right. Your D&D character could never become a tiny little wizard. Wink. What was that you said about an elderly gnome?
No, for real. I haven't even played the judge version of Sweeney yet. Let's not claim that you're him.
You're right. And certainly he won't become me. This is not his final form. Wink.
Stop saying wink. No, because see, part of the fun of the judge is that I have no idea where his story is going. His future is totally out of my hands. He could potentially keep popping up forever. So I don't think we should tell people that my D&D character will eventually become you, because that's just not true.
You're right. The judge is inspired by the Doctor.
Yes. Exactly, now you're getting it. And the Doctor is meant to just go on being the Doctor forever. And the Doctor would never take on a new identity and interact with his younger self under a new alter ego.
It worked. It's still out there.
I'm only a humble curator, I'm sure I wouldn't doubt.
You're not the judge.
Well, we'll see. Toodles!
He's seriously not the judge. They are absolutely different characters. In fact, if I ever get the chance to play the judge, I probably will make some videos about that experience. Which means I just need to be a player in some more games. I gotta get on that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little tour through what I think about when I'm creating characters. As you can tell, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what makes a D&D character compatible with the rest of the group. And in fact, I have another idea for a character who I always wanted to play, another wizard, unsurprisingly, but I don't think I ever will. Because I think the creative challenges in designing that character is a lot of fun, but the challenges in playing them would be very difficult to overcome and possibly not even worth it. So if you want to see a video about a fantastic D&D character I will probably never play, let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, hit the like button, make sure to subscribe, and ring the bell so you get notified about new videos. My next video should be a Critical Role Demystified video if all goes according to plan. And if you want to watch the video where I talk more about the Judge and the Journal of the Judge, watch this video here where I incorporate that magic item as part of my 5-room dungeon. Until next time, play fair, and have fun.